0347 local time. The Strait of Hormuz. A U.S. Navy Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, hull lit only by the soft amber glow of its Combat Information Center, threads the deep water channel between Larak Island and the Omani coast. 21 nautical miles of navigable water. Less than 9 miles at its narrowest contested edge. On the bridge, the officer of the deck reads a phase line he has crossed 100 times before. Tonight, the surface picture is wrong. The SPY-1D radar, sweeping in elevated track mode, paints 25 fast contacts breaking from the lee of Keshim Island in a fan formation. Speed, 38 knots, accelerating. Profile, low, small, multiple. The fire control technician calls them out in clipped voice. Bagamars. Paycap-class fast attack craft. A handful of larger Hodong derivatives carrying anti-ship missiles. The watch officer keys the 1MC. General Quarters. Within 90 seconds, the destroyer is buttoned up, weapons-free authority cascading down from 5th Fleet through the strike group commander to the captain on the bridge wing. What the world would later be told is that an Iranian swarm was repelled in a brief skirmish. A few boats damaged. A measured American response. A diplomatic footnote. That is not what happened in the strait that night. The visible layer of this engagement, the one shaped for press briefings and cable news loops, was simple. A U.S. warship, transiting in accordance with international law, was harassed by Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy small craft. The destroyer defended itself. Tehran absorbed the embarrassment quietly because admitting the full scale would mean admitting something far more uncomfortable. That is the surface narrative. It is clean. It is digestible. And it omits almost everything that matters. Because underneath that engagement sat a doctrinal collision that the IRGC had been rehearsing for nearly 2 decades, and that the United States Navy had been quietly building countermeasures against the entire time. The boats were not the threat. The boats were the delivery mechanism. The threat was the geometry. And the geometry, for the first time in operational memory, broke in front of a single hull. So the question is not how one destroyer survived 25 attackers. The question is what Tehran learned in the 47 minutes that followed, and why it chose to bury those lessons rather than broadcast them. Begin with the platform. The Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer displaces just over 9,000 tons in its Flight IIA configuration. 509 feet long. Crew of roughly 330 sailors. Powered by 4 General Electric LM2500 gas turbines, pushing it past 30 knots when the situation demands. But the steel and the speed are not what defines this ship. What defines it is the Aegis combat system, a sensor and weapons integration architecture that fuses radar, electronic warfare, and 96 vertical launch cells into a single decision-making organism. Standard missile, 2 and SM-6 interceptors for air threats. Tomahawk land attack missiles for deep strike. Evolved Sea Sparrow for terminal defense. 2 Phalanx close-in weapon systems. A 5-inch Mark 45 gun forward. 2 MH-60R Seahawks in the hangar, one of them already turning rotors before the second salvo of warnings went out over bridge-to-bridge Channel 16. Against this, the IRGC Navy fielded a doctrine of asymmetric saturation. The logic is elegant on paper. A destroyer cannot engage 25 fast contacts simultaneously with its primary weapons. A phalanx burst lasts seconds. A 5-inch round costs thousands of dollars. A standard missile costs over $2 million. An IRGC speedboat with a heavy machine gun and a recoilless rifle costs less than a used pickup truck. The exchange ratio, in theory, favors Tehran. Overwhelm the sensors. Crowd the firing solution. Get inside the minimum engagement range of the larger missiles. Press close enough that the destroyer cannot use its full arsenal without risking fratricide on neutral shipping. And then, if even 1 or 2 boats survive the gauntlet, deliver the kill with a Nasser or Kausar anti-ship missile from inside 10 kilometers. The math, on paper, is brutal for the larger ship. The strait itself amplifies this logic. The traffic separation scheme funnels commercial tankers into 2 narrow lanes, each only 2 miles wide, with a 2-mile buffer between them. A warship transiting these waters cannot maneuver freely. It cannot accelerate to flank speed without risking collision. It cannot fire in arcs that cross commercial traffic. It is, by the geography alone, partially disarmed. The IRGC built its entire surface doctrine around exploiting this constraint. Bases at Bandar Abbas, Bandar Lenja, and on the islands of Abu Musa, Greater Tunb, and Siri allow rapid sortie of small craft from multiple bearings simultaneously. A swarm does not need to attack from one direction. It needs to attack from 5. That was the visible architecture. That was what the press would have understood if Tehran had ever allowed the full briefing to surface. But there was a structural problem inside that doctrine. And the destroyer's captain knew it before he ever crossed the Hormuz phase line. The problem with swarm tactics is that they assume the target is a single sensor and a single shooter. They assume a closed system. A lone destroyer, isolated, reacting only with what is mounted on its own deck. Under that assumption, the math works. 25 boats against 96 cells and 2 phalanx mounts is a contest. Saturate the engagement timeline, get inside the reaction window, force the larger ship into a defensive crouch. Even if you lose 20 boats, the 5 that survive carry warheads that can mission kill a billion-dollar hull. But that assumption has a flaw. It treats the destroyer as a lone. And in the Strait of Hormuz, in the year of this engagement, no Arleigh Burke transits alone. Ever. The cost-exchange ratio looks one way when you count only what is mounted on the destroyer's deck. It looks entirely different when you count what is loitering above it, what is listening to it, and what is waiting 12 minutes over the horizon. This is where the hidden variable enters the equation. The destroyer that night was operating under a layered surveillance and strike umbrella that the IRGC's tactical commanders almost certainly underestimated. At 28,000 feet, a U.S. Air Force RC-135 rivet joint was orbiting a racetrack pattern off the Omani coast, harvesting every emission across the Iranian littoral. At 50,000 feet, a global Hawk drone was painting the entire surface picture in synthetic aperture radar. 80 miles to the southeast, a second destroyer, hull number withheld in subsequent reporting, was already on a converging course. And 140 miles further out, the deck of a Nimitz-class carrier was preparing to launch a foreship of F/A-18 Super Hornets armed with AGM-84 harpoons and laser-guided Maverick missiles. The man inside the destroyer's Combat Information Center, whom we will call Commander Holloway, was not improvising. He was executing a pre-rehearsed contingency that the strike group had wargamed 11 times in the preceding 6 months. His role was not to survive the swarm in isolation. His role was to absorb the opening salvo long enough for the architecture above and around him to collapse the engagement from multiple axes. His tactical action officer, a lieutenant commander with 2 prior Gulf deployments, made the call that defined the night. She did not authorize a standard missile launch. She did not waste vertical cells on targets that did not warrant them. Instead, she vectored the Seahawk helicopter, already airborne, into an outer screen at 3 miles, armed with Hellfire missiles and a door-mounted Ju-21. She held the 5-inch gun on the lead boat, the command vessel, the one she had identified by its slightly different radar return and its position at the geometric center of the fan. And she waited. The first IRGC boats opened fire at 4,000 yards. Heavy machine gun rounds skipped off the destroyer's superstructure, leaving dents in aluminum but no penetration. The phalanx auto-engaged a Nasser missile launched from one of the trailing Hodong derivatives at 3,000 yards. The missile broke up in flight, debris falling into the channel. The Seahawk, by then in position, killed 3 boats in under 90 seconds with paired Hellfire engagements. The 5-inch gun walked rounds across the command vessel and reduced it to a burning hull within 4 salvos. But that was only the opening minute. That was still the visible layer. The real pressure sat underneath it. Because at the moment the first IRGC boat opened fire, the rivet joint had already correlated the radio traffic from the swarm's command net with a shore station outside Bandar Abbas. The Global Hawk had identified 2 additional boat formations attempting to sortie from Keshem to reinforce the attack. The carrier's Super Hornets, already aloft, were vectored to a strike box 20 miles north of the destroyer's position. And an EA-18G Growler, the electronic attack variant flying in trail, began saturating the IRGC's tactical communications with a level of jamming that effectively severed the swarm's command and control from its shore-based controllers. The boats in the water did not know it yet, but they were no longer being directed. They were operating on their last received orders, in a channel they could no longer hear out of. And that changed the geometry. Because a swarm without command and control is not a swarm. It is a collection of individual boats, each with limited fuel, limited ammunition, limited situational awareness, and a fixed mission profile. They cannot adapt. They cannot reform. They cannot break off. They cannot coordinate a second pass. They become, in operational terms, a queue of individual targets being fed into a kill chain that now spans 3 platforms and 2 domains. The Super Hornets arrived at minute 14. The Harpoons were never launched, because by then there were no targets large enough to justify them. Instead, the strike package shifted to laser-guided Mavericks and gun runs. 7 more boats were destroyed in the next 11 minutes. The remaining vessels, those that had not been hit, began to scatter back toward Iranian territorial waters at full throttle. They were not pursued. The destroyer held its course down the traffic separation scheme. The carrier recovered its aircraft. The rivet joint continued its orbit. In 47 minutes, 25 Iranian fast attack craft had been reduced to roughly 7 survivors. The destroyer had taken superficial damage to its superstructure. No American sailors were killed. The signals intelligence haul from the engagement, the IRGC's command protocols, emergency frequencies, fallback procedures, was, according to subsequent assessments, the most valuable single-night collection on Iranian naval operations in over a decade. This was the slaughter Tehran hid. Not because the casualty count was unbearable. The IRGC has absorbed worse losses in its long history. It was hidden because of what the engagement revealed about the doctrine itself. The swarm concept, the foundational asymmetric strategy that Iran has marketed for 20 years as its answer to American naval superiority in the Gulf, was demonstrated, under operational conditions, to be vulnerable to a layered response that Tehran had not adequately accounted for. The boats were not the failure. The boats performed roughly as designed. The failure was the assumption that the destroyer was the target. The destroyer was the bait. The real engagement happened in the electromagnetic spectrum, in the command links, in the sensor fusion between 5 different American platforms operating across 3 domains. Admit that publicly, and you admit that the entire deterrent value of the IRGC Navy's small boat fleet, the thing that has made every American carrier strike group commander think twice before pushing into the Gulf, is contingent on assumptions that no longer hold. Admit that, and the strategic calculus shifts. Insurance premiums on Gulf shipping recalibrate. Allied navies in the region reassess. The price of crude moves on the assumption that the strait is not as closable as Tehran has long implied. So Tehran said nothing. Or rather, Tehran said what could be said. A minor incident. A few losses. American aggression. The usual vocabulary. But the lesson, internally, was unmistakable. The next swarm doctrine will look different. It will rely less on radio command and control. It will incorporate one-way attack drones launched in parallel with surface craft. It will probe at moments when the carrier strike group's airborne. Assets are degraded by weather or maintenance cycles. It will seek to engage when the destroyer is not, in fact, embedded in a layered architecture, but is genuinely alone, transiting at the seam between 2 operational areas. That is the engagement that has not yet happened. And that is the engagement the IRGC is now quietly building toward. The Strait of Hormuz carries roughly 20% of global oil consumption through a corridor narrower than the Long Island Sound. Every transit by every warship of every nation is a small experiment in deterrence. What happened that night was not a battle. It was a stress test. The visible result was a one-sided American victory. The hidden result was a doctrinal recalibration on both sides, conducted in silence, by men in rooms with no windows, looking at maps that civilians never see. Commander Holloway's destroyer completed its transit at sunrise. The traffic separation scheme resumed normal operations within hours. The tankers kept moving. The price of oil ticked up by less than $1 before settling. To the world, nothing had happened. To the men and women who had been listening, watching, and waiting, something fundamental had shifted. A doctrine had been tested under real conditions and found wanting. A reserve architecture had been validated. And a new question had quietly entered the strategic conversation in both Tehran and Manama. What happens the next time, when the layered architecture is not there? Because the lesson of Hormuz is not that one destroyer can defeat 25 boats. The lesson is that no warship, however capable, defeats a swarm alone. The lesson is that the visible hull is the smallest part of the actual combat power. And the lesson is that the side that understands this first, and builds doctrine around it, holds the corridor. Tehran understands it now. Whether Washington keeps building on it, or whether budget pressures and shifting priorities erode the layered umbrella over time, is a question that will be answered not in press conferences, but in the next engagement, on a night that has not yet been written. What matters is not what is already visible above the waterline. It is what arrives next, from the directions no one is watching. If this kind of strategic breakdown is what you came here for, consider subscribing and staying with the channel. The next analysis goes deeper into the corridor, and into the engagements the headlines never quite explained.